Good afternoon, everyone. Apanantru Adorahi Namona. Welcome to the latest online business briefing from Business Advantage PNG.com, PNG's top-ranked online business magazine. My name is Andrew Wilkins, Publishing Director at Business Advantage International, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's economic update on Papua New Guinea. Welcome, no matter where you're from. We have viewers from all over PNG here today, including Port Moresby, Lae, Mount Hagen, Goroka, Arawa, Tabubal. Welcome to our international attendees in Australia, Japan, Fiji, the United States, the Philippines, New Zealand, India, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the United Kingdom. First, I'd like to thank KPMG in Papua New Guinea, who are sponsoring this afternoon's event. This is enabling us to bring it to you free of charge, so our thanks to Zani Theron and her team. Before we start, two things. We won't have time for a live question and answer session today, but I'd still like to draw your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. You can click on this tab to pose a question for either of our presenters today. We will be forwarding these questions to them and will circulate any responses back to you that we receive. I'd also like to confirm that this afternoon's session is being recorded, and we will be sending you a link to the recording by email afterwards. We will also make a PDF copy of the World Bank's slide presentation available to you as well. Now, to our topic today. There's no question that the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the global economy hard, and PNG is a part of that economy, inevitably. Today, our two expert speakers are going to explore the impact of COVID-19 on PNG's economy. How is the crisis affecting PNG's international trade? How will it affect government finances and the government's ability to fund its programs? What about business conditions in the country, foreign exchange shortages, government spending, the impact on sectors such as mining, petroleum, and the non-resources sector? And how can PNG best deal with the challenges the crisis has thrown up? What are the prospects for growth in the coming year? A lot to cover. Our speakers today are in a very strong position to give you an informed and up-to-date view of exactly what's going on. Ilyas Sarsenov is the World Bank's country economist for Papua New Guinea, and it's his job to produce reliable and authoritative information on exactly how PNG's economy is travelling. The bank is releasing a new update tomorrow, and you are getting an exclusive preview of that information here this afternoon. Scott Roger, our second speaker, is the PNG Mission Chief for the International Monetary Fund in Papua New Guinea. As many of you may know, the IMF has this year commenced a new staff monitoring program in PNG to assist the government. Scott will be providing you with an update on exactly what the IMF is doing in PNG and how it will affect government programs. Now, due to the need to manage three completely different time zones during today's briefing in PNG, Kazakhstan, and the United States, these presentations were recorded just a little earlier. We'll start with Ilyas, who'll provide a slide presentation followed by a short interview with myself, and then we'll go on to hear from the IMF. We should be finished well before 3 o'clock this afternoon. So we'll start with Ilyas.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you to Business Advantage PNG for inviting me to present our current analysis on the economy of Papua New Guinea. Our current PNG economic update is on the COVID-19 crisis. And its title is In the Time of COVID-19, From Relief to Recovery. And I would like to use this opportunity to provide some highlights from our current analysis. In this presentation, I would like to communicate three key messages to the audience. The first one is basically to provide some highlights on the economy of Papua New Guinea, since it has been hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis. But it would be also good to understand the drivers behind the crisis, which I will try to outline in my next slide. Then we all know that the authorities reacted swiftly, which our institution welcomes and considers as an adequate response to the crisis, both for the emergency health measures, but also economic support and relief measures, which I will also try to cover in my presentation. And lastly, we would like to encourage the authorities to look beyond the current crisis mitigation measures and see what the next year will bring, and how to make the recovery that will follow more robust and resilient over the medium term. Without any ado, let me turn to the economic analysis first. And in the next slide, you can see two graphs on the GDP growth in Papua New Guinea over a period of 6 years, looking 3 years in the past and then 3 years in the future, including the current year. And as you can see, these swings in real GDP growth suggest that Papua New Guinea and its economy is vulnerable to external shocks. And in 2018, we all know that the earthquake hit the highlands region of the country and affected oil and gas and gold production. But this year we see another shock that hit hard the economy of Papua New Guinea, and we all the observers expect GDP growth and the economy of Papua New Guinea to contract this year. The magnitude of contraction differ from one observer to another observer, and we will hear from the IMF today about their estimates. But overall, we expect that the real GDP growth will decline by about 4 percentage points and to a negative area this year. But then the magnitude again differ, and we in our analysis we presented 2 cases, high case and low case, and we believe that the low case prevail. And in the case of this economy, some domestic factors, especially recent disputes around license extension for Porgera, the gold mine, is one of a downside factor that may bring the impact from the COVID-19 crisis this year even lower than we currently expect. The second graph shows the composition of GDP growth, looking at the resource economy and non-resource economy. And if we look back in 2018, again, you can see that the main driver behind the previous crisis 2 years ago was the resource economy and the LNG sector and gold production in particular. Whereas in 2020, you can see that both the resource economy and the non-resource economy were hit by the current crisis. So we expect some negative production or a decline in production in the resource sector due to demand and price effects, which I will cover in my next slides. But more importantly, the non-resource economy is expected to stop growing this year because of the external but also domestic decisions to restrict movement of people and the operation of businesses during the lockdown period. On the driver's side, you can see that from the external side, there are 2 effects: the volume effect, which is the first graph, and the price effect, which is the second graph. And our analysts at the World Bank expect that this negative global economic condition will prevail in the rest of 2020. Therefore, the global trade for the year will be much negative and severely affected by the COVID crisis, impacting demand for key commodities produced and exported by Papua New Guinea, including LNG, gas, mineral production, but also agricultural produce. On the price side, the impacts are also negative. If you can see, during the last several years, and in 2020 in particular, the prices went down, and therefore the terms of trade shock that adds to the volume shock this year is another factor that is driving the economic growth in Papua New Guinea down. As a result, if we look at the external sector, this weaker external demand and lower commodity prices did put an extra pressure on the balance of payment. And you can see the current account balance on the left side graph, and then the overall balance of payment on the right side. So we do expect that the current account this year will decline from around or close to 15% of GDP, down from around 25% of GDP of last year. As a result, you can see that the overall balance of payment on the right side will turn to the negative area, creating an additional financing need to cover the BOP gap. And in simple terms, these developments will lead to high pressure on the exchange rate. And if the central bank, the Bank of Papua New Guinea, decides to maintain stability for the exchange rate, then in its turn, it may put an extra pressure on official reserves and may require the authorities, both the government and the central bank, to work with development partners to bring more foreign exchange into the economy through official loans. And the IMF, our IMF colleagues will cover the recent rapid credit facility funding that became available to the country. But it is apparent that more needs to be done to finance the emerged financing gap on the balance of payment side. I would like to leave these discussions to our IMF colleagues, and in my presentation, focus more on the fiscal response of the government, which is my next slide. At the World Bank, we assess the government's or the response plan of the authorities, and overall we do assess this plan as a very rapid one and an adequate one, knowing that the fiscal space in Papua New Guinea is limited because government revenue is low and will be affected by the current prices, whereas spending needs are high, and because of the COVID crisis, as we all know, and as presented in this chart table, the government will increase its spending using on-budget but also off-budget resources to stimulate the economy and address health and security issues in the country this year. At the same time, the fiscal space is again limited because of the impact on revenue and expenditure side, and because there is no money available in the sovereign wealth funds to tap in. Therefore, the overall package that the government announced recently, according to our estimates, is around 1.8 billion kina, which is roughly 2.2% of GDP. This is a modest economic support package compared to other countries worldwide and in the region, especially in the East Asia and Pacific. However, the ability of different government differs, and in the case of Papua New Guinea, the limited fiscal space does not allow the government to roll out a bigger package than it is currently available. And as you can see, there are three buckets of policy response measures that the government is trying to address. The first one is health and security measures, including the implementation of the emergency preparedness and response plan, and extra police and defense forces and citizen repatriation due to the COVID-19. In the emergency preparedness and response plan, the on-budget resources which the government utilized are topped up by additional funds available from development partners. And here we have foreign grants provided from Australia, United States, New Zealand, and China. But also our institution, the World Bank Group, provided a health COVID-19 response loan of $20 million to buy required equipment and provide other facilities and training required to address the current COVID-19 crisis. The second bucket of reforms covers social support and price control. We all know that the superannuation funds are participating in the economic response plan by providing savings available to those who became suddenly unemployed during this crisis, and up to 10,000 kina will be available to newly unemployed in the formal sector in the coming months when the changes to the legislation are passed by the parliament. The government has extended limited support through in-kind food assistance in the informal sector, and we know that Prime Minister Marape provided half of his salary through the church system to those in need. But we do see that there is more needs to be done by the government to upscale social assistance in the informal sector, which I will cover in the next section of my presentation. There are also price controls on essential food and household items that the government tries to address and help many households in the country. And the last bucket of support covers business and liquidity support. The government announced a number of measures to support the rural sector and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in particular. So to provide financial support to these enterprises, but also to secure and protect jobs in the country. There is an additional economic stimulus allocation available, which has not been distributed yet. So the development partners and the government are working on identifying some additional needs for this part of the package. Commercial banks extended loan repayment holidays to small and medium-sized businesses. The IRC, the Internal Revenue Commission, provided 2 months tax filing and payment referrals, and the central bank, the Bank of Papua New Guinea, provided liquidity supports to this to the market through the quantitative easing measures. So all of these represent a comprehensive economic support package during the current crisis. And looking at the overall fiscal picture, we do see that the current crisis will lead to higher overall fiscal deficit. And if we look at the current 6 months period, 3 years before and 3 years after, it looks like the expected level of fiscal deficit this year will be a record high level in Papua New Guinea because of the previous policies, but also due to the current crisis. And as a result, this situation will lead to some escalation of the public debt picture, where the debt to GDP ratio may increase above the legislated ceiling of 45% of GDP approved by Parliament last year as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act changes. The government may need to go back to the Parliament and suggest some additional adjustments to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, taking into account the current unprecedented crisis that impacted both the external sector, but also the fiscal accounts of the government. And in my last section of this presentation, I would like to bring to the attention of the authorities, but also other stakeholders and to this audience today, the kind of the picture or the vision for the medium term. So what needs to be done going forward once the current immediate crisis response is rolled out and addressed. And I have already covered the middle part of this table in my previous slides, which covers response of the government to the current crisis. But our institution would like to stress that once the current crisis is over, the government or the authorities in general have to prepare this economy for any future crisis, but also for a more robust and resilient recovery going forward. So we looked at the same set of measures that the government has rolled out recently, looking at health, social protection, and business support. But we also added some macroeconomic sustainability measures that the government needs to look into its future vision when it develops its policies going forward. So let me first start with the health actions. So we, in our framework, we clustered all of these measures around 3 pillars. The first one is protecting lives of the population, and the implementation of the COVID-19 emergency preparedness and response plan is a welcome and very important ingredient to address this current situation. However, at the same time, we do see that regular and financing of the health sector is being undermined by the current focus of the COVID-19 crisis. In particular, function grants and grants provided to the church services, which are also part or a large part, represent a large part of the health system, are being affected during this year, and therefore we would like to encourage the authorities to ensure full and timely disbursements of grants to frontline health service for frontline health service delivery, because otherwise, if the the current virus is addressed, some other diseases may go out of control, and it may impact the health and ability of the population to deliver and contribute to the economy of this country going forward. So this is a very important area that we would like to highlight and stress as part of the future response to the current crisis or any future crisis going forward. On the social protection, we do see that this small in-kind support in the informal sector and a big package of unemployment support in the formal sector lacks some action to extend economic support package to the poor and most vulnerable in this country. Therefore, our advice would be to introduce a targeted social assistance program, so the government can start addressing and helping those in need now. And if another crisis hits this economy, then there will be a framework and an institutional framework to work within and help those in need, especially the poor and vulnerable in Papua New Guinea. Another part of supporting livelihoods of vulnerable households and small businesses is to extend financial support to small firms and businesses beyond the formal sector, but also into informal sector. And therefore, here we see that enhancing community-based financial institutions and leveraging mobile and digital payment technology could be important vehicles to expand the coverage beyond formal sector and include informal sector support as well. And lastly, the third pillar that we do see important for the authorities is to ensure stable and sustainable development going forward. And here we identified three key areas, which is prudent fiscal policy, public debt sustainability, and also physical infrastructure development. The first one, once the economic stimulus package and response is over, and we do expect the deficit and debt to GDP to be higher during crises, but once the crisis is over, it would be good to implement counter-cyclical fiscal policies. So once the economy starts recovering, the government may consider cutting on spending, increasing revenue, and overall this situation and actions should lead to more sustainable fiscal and debt picture in the future. Moreover, it would be important to strengthen debt management capacity, and both of our institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, but also the Asian Development Bank, work with the Treasury to help strengthen this capacity for debt management. And lastly, since we all know that the current government has introduced the Connect PNG program recently, but this crisis may alter some plans of capital spending this year. We would like to see that this Connect PNG program to be resumed next year, taken into account the counter-cyclical fiscal policy and prudent debt management in mind. In the previous PNG economic update, we had some analysis from our latest report, the Change in Wealth of Nations, where we presented Papua New Guinea and compared it with Australia and China, the major trading partners. And why we decided to do this is because GDP growth is an important indicator that economists usually use to assess economies and their well-being. At the same time, the quality of growth and its contribution towards wealth creation is more important for any economy. And in this graph, you can see that Australia and China were very much successful in converting their natural capital into produced capital or physical capital and human capital. And in both of these economies, human capital represents more than half of total wealth in these countries. However, when we look at Papua New Guinea, we see that natural capital and natural resources which contribute to this capital, both in the ground and in the sea, they contribute the most to the current wealth of this nation. However, the economy of Papua New Guinea is lagging behind both on human capital and physical capital or infrastructure, if we put it simply. And therefore, we decided to have a special focus on human capital in our previous PNG economic update. And in this PNG economic update, we decided to focus on physical infrastructure for sustainable development. So let me stop here. This is the end of my coverage of macroeconomic developments and our policy advice to the authorities. However, I would like to encourage the audience to look at our previous PNG economic update with a special focus on human capital development as a prerequisite for inclusive growth, and the current PNG economic update, which will be available online this week, looks specifically at investing in physical infrastructure for sustainable development. Thank you for your attention, and Andrew, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ilyas. And if you could kindly pop on your video, perhaps we can have a very brief chat. I'm not sure what the internet quality is like in your part of Kazakhstan, but it was great for the slides. They came across really clearly. A couple of questions just following your slides. You gave quite a grim view of the global economy towards the beginning of your presentation. And I think there was some estimate of a drop in global productivity of about -14%, which is quite a dramatic drop. Is there any evidence that the key markets to which PNG exports, and I guess we can identify those as the Japan, US, China, Singapore, and so on, whether those particular markets are either more affected or affected about the same as the overall global picture?
Thank you, Andrew, for this question. It is important to look at the key trading partners of Papua New Guinea, and like if we put in a more broader context, we would see that the impact of COVID-19 crisis in Papua New Guinea was different from the other sectors. And yes, especially if we look at GDP growth, one may understand that Papua New Guinea is relatively insulated from the current crisis, because the impacts in other economies is much bigger than in the impact for Papua New Guinea. And let me identify the areas that may lead to a smaller impact in Papua New Guinea's case. There are three areas that we usually look at: the global trade and its impact through the trade channels and through trading partners, as you just identified. But then this is the movement of goods, right? But then the current crisis impacted the movement of people significantly, and then we do see in many economies, including Papua New Guinea, tourism sector was affected by the current crisis, but also the movement of people for work may impact remittances. And lastly, the investments, right? Foreign direct investments are impacted during crises, especially for emerging market and developing economies. And Papua New Guinea is part of this group. And usually investors fly out from
thank you very much for your time today.
During crises.
The situation with foreign exchange in Papua New Guinea has been difficult for business to navigate for quite some time, for several years now. There's been a shortage of foreign exchange in the country, and that has limited the ability of companies to repatriate profits to their home countries where they have a PNG based operation, and it has limited the ability of PNG based companies to purchase goods and inputs from overseas and pay on a timely basis. Your presentation suggests that this foreign exchange problem is going to continue, or maybe even worsen this year, given that PNG's borrowings are going to have to increase to cover government deficits. Should we therefore expect greater delays this year with foreign exchange payments and purchases as far as the PNG's banking system is concerned? It would seem almost inevitable, would it not?
Well, it's not an easy question that you just raised. And again, as I mentioned during my presentation, I would like to refer and ask our IMF colleagues to contribute more to this discussion. But as you well know, both of our institutions advocated for a more flexible exchange rate regime in Papua New Guinea, because it may serve better the economy overall and the governments in particular to address these issues that you just outlined for the private sector development, but also prepare the economy better for any similar external shock that the economy is experiencing this year, because the more flexible exchange rate is a better shock absorber compared to the current regime that the central bank decided to apply for the last several years already. We do see that.
So devaluation would be something the World Bank would like to see, of the devaluation of the kina.
Well, the devaluation is a strong term, and many see it as a one-off sharp adjustment. So by more flexible exchange rate regime, we both of our institutions, I believe, refer to a more gradual adjustment of the exchange rate.
Right.
So a depreciation would be a more relevant terminology to be applied here. And again, our IMF colleagues today will provide some estimates of the Kina overvaluation pre-COVID crisis, and as you rightly pointed out, the current crisis adds more pressure to the exchange rate situation, requiring the exchange rate to be adjusted one way or another. But then the magnitude of the adjustment, the duration of the adjustment, and the approach, be it one-off or a gradual approach, is certainly up to the government and the central bank to consider. And they certainly should take into consideration the needs that the population and the private businesses see currently. And it's not a secret that the FX backlog situation has deteriorated, and to address this backlog situation, the government continue doing business as usual. But as you just pointed out, it will require more external financing resources to be available to the government and the central bank. Otherwise, the pressure would remain, and it may lead to a depletion of official reserves, which I'm sure the central bank does not want to see in this year and in the future, and leads to additional pressures for and obstacles for the private sector development in this economy.
Ilyas, with that, we might end the formal part of our talk today. Thank you very much for your time, and take the very best of care, and we hope to see you back in PNG again sometime soon in the future. And you're now back with me. Our sincere thanks to Ilyas Sarsenov for that presentation and for the interview. My apologies for the small glitch during the interview there. That was due to the connection to Kazakhstan. Just a reminder that we will be providing you with a copy of Ilyas's slides by email after this briefing, and the entire briefing today is also being recorded for you. Our second speaker is Scott Roger. Scott is the PNG Mission Chief for the International Monetary Fund in Papua New Guinea. The IMF is working closely with PNG's government currently. Clearly, the economy and government finances have been knocked off course, and we asked Scott to talk about how it's going to get back on track. So perhaps you could watch that video, please.
Hi, my name is Scott Roger. I'm a Deputy Division Chief in the Asia Pacific Department of the IMF, and I'm the Mission Chief for Papua New Guinea. Today, I'd like to talk about the macro situation in Papua New Guinea and the status of two programs. One is a staff monitored program, and the second is the Rapid Credit Facility program that Papua New Guinea has entered into. First, I'll give some background, and then I'll go through the staff monitored program and then the Rapid Credit Facility program. The documents covering the staff monitored program and the Rapid Credit Facility are both available on the IMF's website, but I assume that you may not want to wade through those documents, so I basically give you the lowdown on those things now. So the background here is that, as probably most of you know, since the LNG boom faded in about 2013, the Papua New Guinea economy has underperformed. The economy has seen lackluster growth in both the resource and non-resource sectors. There's been little success in achieving sustained fiscal consolidation. As a result, there's been a string of deficits and rising public debt. And the country has had chronic foreign exchange shortages with exchange restrictions, and this all reflects an overvalued exchange rate. The IMF advice by my teams and my predecessors' teams has been fairly consistent in advocating fiscal consolidation and monetary and exchange rate reforms aimed at restoring exchange rate flexibility at an appropriately valued rate. We've also advocated structural reforms aimed at improving the efficiency of the economy. So let me turn now to the staff monitored program. The situation there was the new government, which came in June 2019, decided that the macroeconomic challenges that Papua New Guinea faced required a fairly comprehensive overhaul of government policies. Discussion of a possible program began during the annual Article 4 consultation, which is an annual kind of report card we do on the economy. The Minister of Treasury asked us to return and start discussing a staff monitored program. So we returned in October and in early November to negotiate a staff monitored program. I should emphasize that the staff monitored program is a bit different than many other programs that the fund offers. It does not include money, and it is very much a program of the authorities. It needs to reflect the authorities' policy priorities. Our job is to help put those priorities into a coherent program that is sustainable from a medium-term perspective. We couldn't endorse a program that was ultimately unsustainable. So our task was to provide essentially a comprehensive framework within which the authorities' policies could fit. We worked closely together with the authorities and came up with a program that has three main elements. First element is fiscal consolidation. And here the focus, we decided to focus on a sort of a core part of the budget, which includes ongoing spending, leaving out some one-offs, and I can tell you about those in a moment, and to ensure that that spending over the medium term was consistent with the revenue projections and would lead over time to fiscal consolidation, bring the debt to GDP ratio, the public debt to GDP ratio, down from around 40% over the longer term to 30%, which was stipulated in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The key things required to achieve that outcome were, first and foremost, to bring personnel emoluments, the wage bill, under control. And the second thing was to control or reduce the SIPs, the service improvement programs, not because they're necessarily bad, but because there was very little accountability for how the money was being spent. Then there's a part that we called non-core, and that is essentially one lower priority spending. One of the areas was the arrears. We agree completely that clearing up the arrears is important, but we considered it to be less urgent than, say, paying teachers or paying for hospital care. If the money was available, it's an excellent way to spend the money. Similarly, with some of the development spending, we consider that to be less of a priority. And if the money was available, then we did not want to stop the government from spending money on that. But it was to be considered outside the core. The second element of the program was monetary and exchange rate reform. The government wants to restore Kina convertibility. In our view, this requires three things. One is reducing the backlog of unfilled foreign exchange orders. Second is adjusting the exchange rate to a market clearing level. And third is removing exchange restrictions and impediments to the restoration of interbank trading. However, there's a second element here. If you move back towards a flexible exchange rate, you need to still have control over monetary policy. So that means strengthening the central bank's monetary operations and essentially giving the central bank another tool to influence monetary conditions, and that's interest rates. So to do this, the central bank needs to provide proper incentives for the banks to use the interbank market rather than come to the central bank for money in the first instance, if they're short of liquidity. Second is to improve the central bank's ability to forecast liquidity, which requires information from Treasury on its operations. And the third is to start conducting central bank operations with a view to managing liquidity effectively. If those things can be done, that will give the central bank much more influence over interest rate developments in the economy. Third element of the SMP, Staff Monitored Program, structural reforms. Here, there are three basic aspects. One major area of reform is the medium-term revenue strategy. This is needed to raise sustainable revenue to the government in order to conduct the kind of investment in basic infrastructure that's needed for development of the economy. The government has to be able to afford that. And so it needs sustainable increases in revenue. Second area is SOE reform. The government is keen to undertake reforms to raise the efficiency and strengthen the accountability of state-owned enterprises. We completely support that. Third area is a broader improvement in governance and reduction in corruption to improve the business environment and to increase the efficiency of public spending. A lot of that needs to involve increasing transparency of government operation. All right, so those are the three elements of the Staff Monitored Program. It was approved by IMF management in late February and just in time for the COVID crisis to break out. The crisis has knocked roughly 4 percentage points off our growth projections for 2020 and about 1% off the inflation projection. Export revenues are down by about 10 percentage points of GDP, and fiscal revenue is also down, so the deficit has risen by about 3 percentage points of GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio is going to rise to, we estimate, over 43% GDP. The RCF, or Rapid Credit Facility, has been accessed by 72 countries around the world since March. And Papua New Guinea has received $364 million under the program to address its urgent balance of payments need and the shortfall in fiscal revenues. What I should emphasize is that the RCF is there to help address a short-term problem, a real need for funds by the government to maintain key areas of spending and imports, but it does not change the direction of reform under the staff monitored program. The letter of intent sent by the authorities to request the RCF reaffirms the government's commitment to the objectives of the staff monitored program. What the SMP does here is it holds the government accountable for delivering on their own commitments. There is a very explicit list of commitments in the program. My team is now about to begin the first review of that program. Clearly, some of the quantitative targets that were set for fiscal performance and debt will be missed because of the COVID crisis. Some other structural objectives are going to be missed. The timing, they miss on the timing, again, because COVID has disrupted the government's work. And that's okay. But the commitment and a plan for consolidation need to take into account where the country is right now. It's been knocked off course. It needs to get back on track towards fiscal consolidation and implementing the monetary, exchange rate, and structural reforms that were planned. We will discuss this with the authorities, adjust the program somewhat, and then lay out a revised path for reforms and fiscal consolidation. We expect to finalize that review in late July, and we will then report to the IMF board and make the findings public. So that's where the IMF program is at. We are working very closely with the Papua New Guinea government, and we're optimistic that the program will deliver good results over the medium term. Thank you very much.